A very warm welcome, everyone. I'm Kath White, the ex-chair of the GA Tyne and Wear branch, and I'm standing in for Brenda, the chair today. Before we get started, a quick reminder that everyone's welcome to attend our events, whether you're a GA member or not. They're free, although donations are welcome, and we encourage you to join the GA. We're keen to hear from you about topics you would find useful in our lecture series. You can see the contact details here on the slide, so get in touch with Brenda, Louise, or Amy with any requests and comments. I have a reminder for you to check out the GA's Geography Education Online, or GEO website, which is very useful for those of you working with years 12 and 13 and years 12 and 13 themselves, especially if you're catching up on material missed during the lockdown earlier this year. Their materials and services are excellent in quality, and they are cheaper if you're a GA member. I just want to talk about the talk itself and the chat function. It's really nice for our speakers, Liz and Peter, to have an audience rather than talking to the void of cyberspace. So please keep your camera on if you have one and you feel comfortable in doing so. If you have a question, you can pop it in chat and we will compile them for a session at the end of today's workshop. You can also use the raise hand function for when you want to ask a question at the end. Also, if you can please give us your full name and email address so we can send you a certificate for this talk, that would be very helpful. And this would include all the names if you're watching in a group. These certificates are very useful for the UCAS personal statements, school prizes, and parents love to see them. You can put down your email for your certificate, either on the chat, or you can email Louise, who's the second one down in that list. Her address is on the screen. I'd like to introduce today Liz and Peter. Both are running the workshop, and Liz will be talking first. Liz Cowans worked as a geography teacher for over 30 years. With her vast experience, she worked as the geography advisor for Newcastle Local Education Authority and also won an Excellence in Cities Award. Liz then went on to undertake numerous roles in the Ouseburn and with the Ouseburn Trust. As an advisor and volunteer, Liz has helped schools to utilize the Ouseburn Valley as an educational environment through resource provision to enhance fieldwork opportunities. She also has submitted various bids for funding within this role. Liz has also actively worked as a tour guide for both Overland and the Victoria Tunnel tours. Liz has been an active and dedicated member of the GA, providing themed workshops for teachers using the Ouseburn as a base for many years. Peter Glaves was a principal lecturer in environmental assessment and management in Greenwich University from 1992 to 2006. He then worked part-time as Deputy Director at the Biodiversity, History and Landscape Research Institute from 2006 to 2009, as well as being Principal Lecturer in the Department of Environment at Manchester Metropolitan University from 2007 to 2010. He was Associate Professor of Environmental Management and Director of Enterprise and External Engagement at Northumberland University from 2010 to April 2020. Peter is now a sustainability and environmental management advisor, providing specialist training, lecturing, and mentoring in aspects of environmental management, sustainable development, conflict management, and community empowerment. So you can see we have two experts to talk to us about photography and the Ouseburn today. So Liz, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Hopefully.
So Carl, do you want to shut down your screen? Yeah, that's it. Brilliant.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Hurrah.
There we go. Hurrah.
Hurrah. Good evening, everybody. I'm hoping you're going to enjoy the session from Peter and me. We're looking at photographs in the Ouseburn and how to analyse them. So really and truly, I'm just the warm-up band because Peter's the expert on this. Photo analysis is quite important, especially if we're doing personal inquiries. So I've put together two activities, really, both of which are covered by any materials that we might have sent to you during the actual applying for the meeting tonight. We're going to look at two sections or two areas of photography, especially using it for the Ouseburn. We'll look at the introduction, where outlines can be used to annotate and put labels on photographs. And then I've chosen a specific site, and that specific site is going to be the lead works near to the bridge, the Northumberland lead works. And we're going to look at it through time and see what we can use. Harking back to what Peter was talking about last week, we can ask questions about the area in order to make up a really nice answer. We could use where, what happened, when, what took place. So it doesn't make a nice word, I'm afraid, but it gives you an idea about how you can progress through the years with a specific site. Oops. I've chosen some photographs from the mouth of the Ouseburn, which we use for regeneration on Spillers Wharf. I'm not very good at Photoshop, so I asked John Hipkin to do them for me. They've come out really nicely. You can use an app on your phone if you want to take a photograph. I do find that labeling a sketch is much nicer than actually labeling the photograph itself. It's clearer. And you can see on these two photographs at the front, the mouth of the river, sorry, John created a sketch where you can nicely add labels, whereas you've got the original next to it. It was part of Spillers Wharf and stakeholders, but it gave you an idea about what the area was like. And this is the hub. When we were looking at regeneration on this area, there is the hub, but there are also houses behind, and these would not be cheap, enjoying a lovely vista of the river. Whether or not they think the vista is going to be quite as nice when it's got a giant wheel there, or it's got the Geordie Giant, or you've got a rotating screen, I'm not sure, but the noise and everything else which goes with lights could cause a problem. You could annotate it with suggested development on the actual quayside. The other thing as well, of course, with this one is that Igloo and Homes for People want to develop this particular section for an area of flats. So it could be quite contentious if you have all the people coming to a meeting and saying what they wanted in order to develop this area. So we're going to start with the idea of the lead works. I've put together two maps. One's obviously the 1896, approximately, and I coloured in the lead works, and you have the river there, which you can see along there in blue. It's quite a large site, and it evolved over time. I've put in a cheat sheet, which will help you label it as well. One of the things which is nice to see is that coming down past the Ship Inn, there is a road which would have been the original one to the ford, which is here, with two series of stepping stones, and then carts could come down. Whoops, no, they couldn't. Carts could come down, cross the ford. We know it's going to be a low water ford, but you can leap from the stepping stones across and then up Biker Bank. As soon as this was built, there was no need for you to come down into the valley. So we're looking at the idea of the lead works, which is quite big. And then we're going to think about, this is the 1896, what happened later on. About 1945, it's now a paintworks. It's not terribly nice. It's warehousing. It's an abattoir. Houses have been knocked down, and the whole area is different. We've gone from heavy quality industry to an area which is mainly storage and a paintworks. So it's very different to what it was before. The cheat sheet just talks about factoids. We've talked about factoids before. John Smith wanted, and Kath very kindly did that one as well. So it gives a sequential development of what happened on the lead works. These could be used for annotating, general interest, use of maps. 1871, John Ismay. But the thing is, the important bit here, that the factory actually used lead, and it oxidized it to come out in a white powder. It then went all over the floor and you had to scrape it up. No wonder people were ill. This is part of your environmental disaster, which came from the white lead. This is important because what happens later on the site is linked directly back to this. Ismay, which I didn't know, was a company that worked with white lead, and it used that white lead, or it was used for paint, but they had a huge cosmetic industry where white lead was used for making various preparations, almost like arsenic, to give you a nice white skin. Over time, it started to decline. So Ismay and James, which was just further up the river, combined together. Then it turned into a paintworks, and then it closes in the 1960s. The areas in the Ouseburn were swiftly cleared out. We know that the housing went in the 30s and the 60s and 70s, and we know as well that this building went and was obviously knocked down. However, the lead which came from the lead works left a legacy, which was an environmental disaster. I took my children down to, well, one of them down to see the animals. And it was lovely. It was a very nice little tourist attraction for urban children who maybe haven't seen many animals before. So here we've got, and this is our activity 5, the first resource is what it looked like in 1970. And the outline, that was the lead works. We asked the question last week, if you looked at this, would you want to invest here or would you want to develop here? And the answer is, it's falling apart, it has to be cleared, and the answer would be no. It's very old and it's very run down. And this is taking us from 1970 upwards to what happened to the current day. We can see another one here. We didn't know when I got this one. I asked the Ouseburn Trust who took it. There was no applicant for it. So you still have to say where the source was, but you can't actually put a name to it. It doesn't look very nice. You can see vaguely on that, it looks like a dark cloud around where the lead works is. In the 1970s, it was cleared, and you can see in the left picture, the bits of brick and the grinding millstones on the right-hand side. But what do you do with it? If we look at planning policy and the movement from heavy industry to more tertiary and leisure activities, this could be something really quite useful. And what they did was they created a city farm, very fashionable at the time. It was a great thing for children to go and look at animals, hold them, because many children who live in urban areas maybe don't have a garden and they don't have the opportunity to see little animals. So fantastic, take them down to the city farm, except it was heavily polluted and therefore had to close. What did they have to do? Well, they had to strip the soil down until you could be sure that there was going to be no lead residue left. You couldn't allow anything to be developed on this if there was a slightest chance that you had something wrong with it. And this gave me the opportunity to think, all right, if we're looking at photographs and we're thinking about them and we're looking at it over time, try and answer the question, what evidence can you see to suggest that the contaminated soil in this area is being removed? If you don't think about it, you get an arrow from one side, you get a wavy arrow from another, you get soil. And this is pure description. It doesn't tell the examiner or whoever's looking at your work anything. You're not telling them that you understand or interpret the photograph properly. But if you have a photograph and you add clear lines, that's a nice line. What evidence? Here you've got an earth mover, it's digging the soil out and it's doing a job which will be extremely difficult because it looks very clayey soil, extremely difficult for ordinary workers to do. And then you've got a nice dumper truck, which you can load into to take it away, and you can manage to create a lower area where the soil is clear. Now, one of the things that you can do if you're working through photographs like this and it's being recorded and you've got the handouts, you can do a bit of work and then you go back and then you stop it again and you do a little bit of work if that's what you want to do. So it's something that you can stop and start and come back to. You don't have to have a massive amount of immediate activity. You've got time to start thinking about it. One of the things that's nice about the Ouseburn is that they are very aware of the environment. The history has not forced people to do that, but the history has encouraged people to be more aware of what the environment's like. So you've got on this area, which was cleared, the Ouseburn farm. And the Ouseburn farm is an eco building with an eco centre, which grows its own crops, allows you to look at animals, and gives you a very nice visitor centre, again, which is to do with leisure, getting out in the fresh air, sound like Boris, getting out in the fresh air and having enjoying the day. The children can hold the animals, they have babies, they can go look at them, there's workshops, and it's enjoyable for the community. And it's an eco design. The lead works was built encompassing buildings when there was a flax works there, but Clark Plummer moved into the one next door designed by Dobson. It had stone flooring because flax tended to go up in flames if you weren't very careful, built after the one at Saltaire where you had an alpaca mill. So the thought that went into this was really very, very good. I will admit that this is an old photograph. This is one of mine again. And at the background, the farm view flats aren't showing, but it would give you an opportunity to be able to go out and take your own photographs to give you an idea of where to stand, take your photograph, and then you can use that as primary data collection. Put a sketch next to it, label it, show what you've learned, and it's a much nicer way of presenting. It's a good experience to do presentation improvement. Eco-design includes lifting the building off the ground, and by doing that, you've got an aerated higher section, which is still really nice, but it stops the cold of the ground seeping through into the building itself. You've also got a green roof, which is, it's a sedum plant. It binds the soil together and it grows using the moisture, and it keeps the building warm as well. These are old photographs. They give you an idea about what site you could go and look at, and you can also gauge what they're growing. It is not a teepee, it's actually a telegraph pole. And in the building, you can actually find a lot of different uses for recycled timber. And that's holding, obviously it's holding up the roof. I'll finish there, but just to sort of pull it all together, the site of the lead works has changed from a heavy polluting, badly environment area where lead's gone into the soil. It destroyed the health of the people who work there, and it would not have made the area around the factory very nice at all. So we've gone from that, and it's travelled in 100 years, it's changed, and it's now an area which is an ecosystem which has really enhanced activities within the Ouseburn Valley. So I'm going to hand over now to Peter, and he's going to carry on. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome, Peter. And let's
Just
hear your different exercises and explanation of how to look at photographs.
Okay, thanks, Liz and Kath, and apologies if this image interrupted the end of your talk. That's the.
Oh no, it's all right. Don't worry about it.
Wow.
Preview. What more can you ask for? There we go. Okay, image in front of you. Hopefully, looking at this image, you can recognise where it is. We've got the River Tyne that's there. It's an English heritage photograph, and looking at the state of the bridge here, the Tyne Bridge being built in the 1920s, completed 1928. We're probably in the mid-late 1920s that's there. So as a geographer, is there anything you can see from this photograph that tells you something about the history, about changing places? Well, certainly you can look at the air quality and the pollution. You may be able to see some chimneys, the fact that the riverside is still being used by boats, offloading cargo, etc. So what I want to do with you for the next half an hour is a little bit of a session on how you might use photographs in your own geographical work. So 3 headings to explore with you here: where you might find the photographs, how you might analyze them, how you might use them. I'm actually going to do it in reverse order, but that's the main themes I'm going to cover then today. So to start off with, here's a photograph. It was taken it's New Year in 2016. It was actually taken in Manchester, but to be honest, this could be Newcastle round the big market on a Saturday night that's there. What I'd like you to do is look at this photograph, and can you see anything in this photograph that might be a geographical issue? Are there any themes or topics relating to geography that you can see in this image? If you're willing to, I'd like you to actually put your answers to that in the comments box for me, and then we'll see on the basis of your answers what information you've come up with. Okay. So in terms of topics, drinking, yeah. Nighttime economy, perhaps. Are there issues in this image that relate to issues to do with police, nighttime activity, disruptive behavior, age populations? Other things are shown here. And if things are being shown in this image, where are those things being shown and how are those things being shown? So Liz was talking about annotation of images. If you think this is saying something geographically, where and how could you annotate an image like this to show something? So that's what I want to explore with you over, as I say, about the next half an hour. I'm going to use some images from the Ouseburn. I'm going to use some images which are more general. So linking back to a slide I used last week I talked about when to use census and data. This week it's about when to use images, qualitative information. So a bit of a repeat from last week. You might be using this in terms of helping to develop your answer plans for your exams. You might in an exam actually be presented with a photograph to use and explore in that actual exam. The second part you might use photographs is in your own independent investigations, your own projects. Now, photographs are useful. Let's be honest, we all spend our lives with these in our hands. How many photographs do you take? What do you take those photographs of? Do you actually analyze them other than quickly swiping, looking at them? Well, as a geographer, it is using photographs everyone produces, but it's using those photographs in a more specific, a structured kind of way. So examples of use of photographs would be, firstly, as an example to illustrate or elaborate on something. If you're describing characteristics relating to river profiles, river characteristics, a photograph with arrows showing meanders, etc., might work really well. Comparisons. You could be looking at different sites now, different parts of the Ouseburn now, which are used, some perhaps for industrial use, some perhaps used for residential nighttime economy. Or perhaps, as Liz was starting to do, showing you photographs of sites now and in the past. Compare and contrast. The last thing you could use with photographs is actually use them as sources of data. And I'll show you how to do that in a few slides' times. So here's an image for you. Now, you might look at that image and go, where the heck is it? If you look on this side here, you might recognize a very familiar logo. This is central Newcastle. This is Northumberland Street. We're back in the 70s here when this was the main road before the bypass had been built. In fact, it was the A1, I believe, wasn't it? It was there. So pedestrianisation, transport, vehicles, changing land use. It's a really interesting photograph showing very different environment, but one that's perhaps familiar to you nowadays when you're allowed to go back into the shops. Liz showed a couple of photographs and was talking about the lead works and the Ouseburn that's there. You can see sort of the kind of product of the industrialization that's there, the spoil, the waste, some of which still underlies things like the orchard next to Ouseburn Farm that's there. But if I wanted to use these photographs, say in an independent study, how could I analyze them? What might they tell me? How could I then annotate them and use them in my argument? Well, let's take a different photograph here. This is a composite photograph because they're still building the site. It's a view of the new development down very close to the Tyne. It's the Lower Steenbergs site. And I could perhaps use this as a photograph illustrating changing land use in the Lower Ouseburn. If I wanted to do that, the most useful thing is to remember to title it and then refer to that title in the text that's underneath. So what could I say about this photograph? That perhaps a Lower Steenberg yard illustrates the changing land use functions, not just in Newcastle, but on a typical urban core edge of the inner city urban core, where we're going from industrial and derelict to very different land uses. We could talk about that this has gone from an ex-industrial derelict site. Here you can see what was previously on the site, the old cattle sanatorium. This is looking upstream, this is looking downstream. That we are now changing that land use to retail and hospitality, local shops and cafes, and I've put a box around, perhaps a number 1 might be a good link there as well. And above those ones, we've got flats, but those flats are aimed at young professionals. So you annotate, you title, you describe. There's something else that this shows. It illustrates the problem of building on an ex-industrial or brownfield site on a floodplain next to a river. You can see the river here. And that's the reason why living property, the place where people live, the flats, is above ground level, the coffee shops and shops at ground level. Because if it floods into someone's house where people are sleeping, then there's a much greater risk of someone being injured and harmed than slowly starting to flood a shop where you can perhaps raise material above the ground. It's easier to get out of that's there. So this is about using photographs, annotating them in your work. Other ways you could use photographs, comparing different locations in the valley in the modern position that's there. Again, in terms of land use, we can see we have industrial units a little bit up towards the 7 stories. We've got converted tourism and office spaces. We've got some areas being used still as allotments and traditional housing that's there. Moving back the transport bridge across, moving down to the riverside, we've got once again the ground floor retail and cafes, conversion of ex-buildings, new flats and properties being built. 2 photographs, same location, different places in that location, different land use functions. And that links to the differences in population that we talked about last week, where you've got a younger population down on the riverside, moving further upstream. Along the Ouseburn, you've got an older population with health problems, different employment characteristics, etc. We could look at historic and present day photographs. So this isn't in the Ouseburn, this is actually along the quayside in Newcastle. This is in the late 1800s, and this is a weekend rag market. So you can see here the people bringing along secondhand, quite worn, quite tatty looking clothing and selling them for a few pence, a little bit of money. So this is trying to sell your own goods to make enough to live. If we go to almost the same location nowadays, there is sales going on, but it's the Saturday and Sunday arts and craft markets along the riverside that's there. So what they're selling is very different to a very different audience, but it's still retail. Interestingly enough, this photograph near the swing bridge, the low-level bridge, was taken in the late 70s, sorry, and actually you can see this young girl selling off her property. So this tradition continued for rather longer than you imagine. Different changing use of the same space. One thing I would suggest is you could use this also at a larger scale, larger areas of land. Here we can see, oops, my mouse is going to work, the River Ouseburn. This has got to be late 1970s because they're building the metro, which I think opened 1980, if I remember correctly. And perhaps compare that to more recent development. So use aerial photographs to look at land use change, but on a bigger scale. Other things to think about. When you're looking at photographs, remember that they are not always taken for the reason you're using them. You may recognize this. This is one of the nightclubs on the big market. The reason why these people took the photograph is probably not for geography. The reason why people 100 years ago took photographs was probably not for someone in their A-level geography in 2020. These 2 photographs are the same view, one night apart. Before the current lockdown, first night of the current lockdown. Now, if I was 100 years in the future, I could look at this second image here and go, good Lord, in the 2020, there was very little nighttime economy in Newcastle, and argue from that picture something which might not be the truth, because a photo is a snapshot. It's taken for a particular purpose. Think of how you take photographs, how your family take photographs. So, how might you use and take photographs for your own geographical studies? Because it might be in your own investigation, you want to use images to illustrate things. First things first, where are photographs useful? Think about the geographical themes and topics where it might be good to have images to help with the words that might help the argument. It might be images showing map distributions, visual patterns or something. When you're wanting to show something visually, ask yourself the question, what's the best way of illustrating this? What's the best evidence? And it might be the best evidence is a photo. It might, however, be the best evidence might be a map with some annotation. Or it might be the best is a table, columns of data, pie chart, something else that's there. Photos are great, but it's not the only way of illustrating a particular theme or topic. If you know a photograph is useful to illustrate something, then think about sites you might want to take the photograph, and think about then how you might use that photograph in your argument. How might you link this image into the text? Remember the development a couple of slides ago? If you are going to use photographs, annotate them or sketch them, do something that shows the person reading it what the image is. Don't just stick it on a page and expect someone to see what you see. Text, notes, arrows, boxes, annotations, incredibly helpful. So I now want to go on to analysing a photograph. And what I would say is there's various methods of doing this. I used to jointly teach a whole undergraduate year-long module in analysing photographs, geophotography. All I can do is give you a bit of an illustration of a method or two today. I'm going to link to some handouts if you want to explore this in your own time when you've got a bit more time to do so. One thing I would say is you need to be objective and consistent in how you do this. So if you were looking at this photograph of Northumberland Street, how would I break it down and analyse it as a geographer? So I want to talk about how you analyse, break it down, and then talk about some questions you might ask. To do that, I want to look at a photograph here. This photograph was taken in the late 1970s. It's in Byker, but it's looking across from Byker towards the Ouseburn. It's taken by Cottonen, who was a Scandinavian lady who moved over to live in Byker and has documented this area ever since there. What is it in this photograph I can see? How might I analyse it to pull out information or evidence? Well, my ex-colleague who I used to teach with, Mike Jeffries, would always say there's 4 themes to look at in a photograph. The first one of those is content. What is in the picture? Sorry, these are going to disappear on the people's heads. Well, we can see some young people there. We can see they're playing on what looks like a bit of a derelict site. We can say there's various bits of televisions and other bits of household goods around them. What is the signs, or the other word that sometimes uses semiotics that's there? Let's put it into different words. What are the things in the photograph signifying? So I could just list them. We have 8 children, we have a radio, we have a television. But actually, if you combine them together, they're talking about decay or derelict sites. They're talking about children playing and dens. It's not just a list of things in a photograph, they symbolize something. You might think about how the photograph's arranged. Why is this person taken this view? You might think about how you respond to that photograph. How many of you, when you saw that photograph, thought it was decades and decades and hundreds of years ago, really long time ago. It's not that far in the distant past that's there. How do you respond to it? That's a list of things. They're big headings. I'm going to now try and break this down into some easier questions for you to use. And to do that, I'm going to use a different photograph. If I can get onto the next page. Okay, screen has stalled. 1 second. Okay. I'm going to come back to that slide in a little bit. It's there. So here's a photograph. You can tell it's probably not taken in the Ouseburn Valley. It's got a hint really on the wall, isn't there? It's there. How could I analyze this photograph? What questions could I ask to help me understand it? What is this photograph about? What is it? Well, it's a photograph. Here's a name of it. Here's a date of it. What is it about? Is it about this, in that? What is shown? What is the photograph called? Does that tell you anything? What themes are in the photograph? What message is that photograph telling you? And that might be the message that David McCullen came up with when he took the photo, or the photo's response that you have when you see it. To help you do this, there's quite a good technique, which is to break the photograph up into quadrants. So looking at this first quarter, we've got inner city, probably the derelict houses, probably Victorian, difficult to look at the quality of them. We've clearly got Nazis here, so it's got to be something about racism taking place. It's there. Within these ones, we can see the location within inner city Bradford. That would fit in perhaps to the population that we're dealing with. We can see in here, we've got 2 young children, West African descent perhaps, that's there. What is it their facial expression is telling you? What is it about the contrast of these people and the message that's there about them and the racism? You can see sort of soil perhaps trampled or abandoned here as well, giving a bit of indication it's a more derelict, rundown city area. It's about homecoming. We live here. This is the kind of thing we're having to deal with. It's a photo about the rise of racism in the late 70s within Bradford. Now, if you want to have a go at this, there's an exercise that I have made available as PDFs based on one of the most famous photographs of the Great Depression in the 1930s, taken by a woman photographer called Dorothea Lange, or Ling. Again, we can break this photograph into quadrants. Here we can see a woman. Age is difficult to look at, but looking at her face, there's worry lines there. It is someone who is suffering, there's pain. If we look at her fingers, you can see the dirt on her fingers. If you look behind, you might just about see the line of the tent that she's living in. If we look at the next quadrant, we've got one of 2 children who are huddling against them. See the dirt on the children's hands that's there. They're obviously living in squalid conditions. They're not happy, they're clinging to their mother. If you then break the quadrant, you might suddenly realize that this is a baby you hadn't noticed before. See again the dirt on a baby's condition. See the state of the clothing that the woman's wearing that's there. What is this photo? What is it about? What is it showing? What are the themes? What are the messages? If you want to explore this further, I've given you a separate handout with lots of web links on them. This photo comes from the Museum of Modern Art in the States. This is the link to the website, and this is the link to the history of that photograph that's there. A classic image in one person illustrating a bigger issue than the pain and suffering of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression of the 1930s. This is a very small version of the sheet I've given you to help you analyse photographs. So we've looked at photographs and we looked at photographic analysis. Bear with me, I'm now going to reverse my slides in my order. And there's one other thing that I suggested that you do, which is look at the annotation. This postcard was annotated at a quaint corner of Newcastle. You have children here with no shoes on, living in poverty. Yet this is sold as a postcard of a quaint corner of Newcastle to Victorian people. That's quite fascinating. It's not just showing the poverty, it's showing an attitude towards it. So look at the titles of photographs, look at text attached to photographs, and that will help you in your analysis as well. How would you get photographs? How might you take them? Well, the starting point could be your photos, the ones that you take. If you are going to take photographs, think about what topics they might be useful for. Here we're taking photographs for a wedding. That's an obvious purpose that's there. Are there A-level topics about populations, changing spaces, etc., where photographs would work? Think about sites locally where it might illustrate it and that could relate to it. Here again, Cottinan, photograph taken about 10 years ago. She took this photograph to illustrate changing masculine roles within a family. Would you see a Victorian photograph of a Victorian father and their child in a similar posture? Other sources of photographs might be secondary sources. And a good location for that is news media, printed or online. We could look at the Chronicle for Newcastle as news media. What I did earlier was I went into their website and did a search for Ouseburn. And interestingly, we can start to see themes. Plan for an Ouseburn hotel. Stunning pictures of Newcastle housing development in Ouseburn. Huge new Ouseburn apartment complex. Work finally going underway on long-awaited Ouseburn development. New vision for Ouseburn townhouses. Is there a theme here? How many times does the Ouseburn in recent photography relate to new development? If it's 90%, it's saying something about, it gives you data, doesn't it? How many times it relocated perhaps to tourism or nighttime economy or other themes. You can generate data from frequency by looking at groups of photographs. If you have photos from the media, we can look at the image related to the text, the headline. 2 photos here with the proposed development linked to approval despite fears of. So you've got the photo and a bit of a written context as well. So photos as data, and photos that you could do what we call a content analysis. How many times is it used and in what way is it used? Another site that you could use could be Instagram, Facebook, anywhere where photographs are loaded. A site I'd suggest you look at is Flickr. Flickr is a kind of Facebook for people who are into photography. And it's got sub-sites in there linked to certain themes. That's the main page. I did a search for the Ouseburn Valley Photography Group. Looking at this again, we have river, bridges, nature, dereliction and graffiti, more bridges, more river, beautiful nature, river again, redevelopment of buildings or nighttime economy, bridges, new building and redevelopment, nighttime economy, nature. There's certain common themes and patterns that we can see here, isn't there? A different source could be Google Maps or Bing Maps, where you can access aerial photographs and street views. I presume you've all used Google Maps at some point. I could type in a postcode for the Ouseburn or a location, and it will give me annotations. I might not be allowed to go out and do transects at the moment because of the COVID issue. Could I perhaps use Google Maps to allow me to do a virtual transect down there? If you're okay time-wise for me, if I run on for about 10 minutes, then what I will do is I will do a new share and we'll go into Google Maps. Ooh. Hello, has that appeared full screen? Or just on the side? It's appeared on the side, hasn't it? Let me I'll stop sharing and then we'll start again. One moment. Okay. Google Maps. Liz talked last week about Stepney Bank. I could go into Stepney Bank. I could do a street view, wander down the street, look at the property and land use blast, SDD live, look at the information, event management company. Moving further down, look at the next transact and locations, look at the information associated with them. Now, I don't know the date the photographs have been taken, so it might be a few years out of date, but it is a way of allowing me to do some virtual transects and use photographs and images in a slightly different way. A couple more sources for you. Skyscraper City is a website which is primarily run by architects, but architects who have particular interests in particular areas. This is the Newcastle metro area. It has pages after pages of photographs of the current northeast, photographs of Victorian developments, etc. that's going forward. So going backwards, let's go and try to show you the website of this. Okay. So this is Newcastle upon Tyne, 492 pages that relate to Newcastle upon Tyne of photographic images. This is the Ouseburn area, and there's a discussion forum started in 2002 with 1,200, nearly 1,300 posts about different developments with designs, comments, drawings, and other information about all that was proposed there. There are also sites that show you information about Victorian developments, other parts of the city, indeed other parts of the northeast. Really great site and source of resource for you to use there. Another location you might want to use is the side gallery. Now, I don't know if anyone's been to the side gallery. It's just up from the quayside, heading up towards Dean Street. They host the website called the Amber Collection, and that is the collection of photographs, mainly photographs, but also old adverts, old videos, and it's all of the Northeast region. You can go in and do searches for film, for visual collections or other images that's there. Okay, the gallery might be currently closed, but you can go on and have a look at those details. I'll show you that website in a moment. Other websites for historical photographs. Francis Frith set up a photographic studio in 1860 to sell photographs of local areas for people and for visitors. Their website has photographs going back to almost the origin of photography. It started in the 1830s, mass external photography around about the 1850s. There are photographs that you can scan through and look at in and around Newcastle. So let's go and try and show you those two sites briefly. So this is the Amber Gallery. I can click onto and start to look at photographic ones, mainly northeast. Okay, would happen to be Blackpool illuminations, not good. Fairgrounds, so you can look at the hoppings, miners, banners and displays going back in time. There's multiple sites that's there. Education resources, exploring information. The Amber Collection, 50 years of shipbuilding, for example, videos, photographs going back throughout the whole period. This is Francis Frith's collection. And if you're looking on a phone, good luck with your eye testing, but you might just about be able to see old images of Newcastle that you can zoom into and look at in a bit more detail. They will have copyright written on them. Acknowledge that if you use them. Couple more sites to show you in the last few minutes, and then I will finish. So Francis Thrift web address is there, and that web address is on a two-sided page of useful Northeast and general websites to help you in your studies. Newcastle Library. Newcastle Library has a range of resources. If you go onto the Newcastle Library site, then you can access through their archive a range of photographs. They also hold on Flickr, do you remember that website we talked about? Their own photographs of Newcastle, and that is everything from life in Newcastle this year to historical photographs to people to education, etc. There's lots of themes. Some of you may have come across Pinterest. Pinterest has its own historic Ouseburn site, 132 pictures of different ages and times and different places, illustrating some themes in and around. Once again, they like their bridges, don't they, in the Ouseburn? It's quite symbolic, isn't it, of the area that's there. Last thing for you to think of. Don't just think of static photos. Historical video and film might also tell you really useful information about a location. And particularly if you have a voiceover or people talking or subtitles, that starts to give you not just images, but images and words about a particular place and a particular time. And to finish off with, I'm going to show you the first minute of a film delightfully called Goats, Boats and Yoppie Flats. It was a time tease piece, about 20 or so minutes long. It's held at the Northeast Film Archive. There's a web link I've given you on the handout that's there. Shall I show it on screen? No, let me show it as an actual full-size video. Okay, that didn't work. Let me try again. Ah, there we go. So, 1986 view of regeneration of the Ouseburn.
Much smaller, less well-known river, the Ouseburn. To the casual observer, it's dirty and neglected, like so many of Britain's city waterways.
So the old cattle sanatorium.
But the river and its valley are the subject of a plan which could transform this quiet backwater. The planners call it the Ouseburn development strategy. The changes they foresee are as varied as the valley itself as it skirts the city of Newcastle. Belongs to the public.
Here we have the Ouseburn farm that Liz was talking about in the early 80s. And if I can get the right point.
The states and businesses have taken it over.
I don't think the pricing was terribly important. The important thing was that it was cheap. And it was cheap because the area was very, very run down. The building was very bleak from the outside. But it was structurally sound. There was lots of potential space that could be developed, again, quite cheap for very small startup businesses, theatre companies that were running on very tight budgets.
I'll pose at that point because it's a great image. So you've got people in the 1980s talking about moving into the area because of cheap prices, allowing small companies, startup companies, art, crafts, etc., to move into the area. You actually saw a moment ago the derelict building, which is now the Cluny. So that nighttime economy, the small units beginning to move into the area in the 1980s. You also have, as part of this video, some great images showing you Victorian, the way that they covered up the river and channelized the river, Ouseburn, and lots of historical information that's there. So I said I would finish at about 5. It is almost about 5. Going back to the last slide that's there. In conclusion, pictures are great. A picture, it's argued, can tell 1,000 words. Make sure, though, if you use a photograph, it's the right words for the right geographical theme that you're looking at. There's a heck of a lot of photographs out of there, a lot of sites that you could look at. Use them selectively as evidence for something. If you use them, link them into the text and the argument, annotate them. If you're interested further, Kath will talk about it. There's a whole session we're going to run on geophotography and what photography's role is in geography on the 25th of January. Time for me to stop. 1 minute past, just overrun.
Well done. Well done.
Well done.
Well done. Thank you both, Liz and Peter, for 2 wonderful talks. You showed us some interesting photographs and videos, and then showed us how to use them in A-level work. You've given us lots and lots of resources and help. So thank you very much indeed. Do you want to have a look at the questions in the chat? Liz, do you want to answer this one about architecture in the Ouseburn?
And which one was that?
Which is right at the beginning.
Oh, right.
And then, Peter, there are people talking about your Manchester photograph, and I don't know if you want to say something about them. From Andrew Davison, have any particular styles of architecture been prominent during the Ouseburn's history, such as Roman, Greek, Neo-Renaissance, such as those particular classical styles that have been used in the Theatre Royal? Anything that jumps out, or were they mostly industrial buildings?
I think it wasn't an area where you had grandiose buildings. Dobson's development of the factory was probably the most impressive, and it was really well thought out, and he used local cast iron columns, and he built it so that it was so solid. It was typical of Northern architecture. So really and truly, as I go on, really and truly, it's effective, and it's, I'm going to use this with great concern, it's solid Northern building, meant to last forever, and it has. The chimney they built was huge. The boilers were brilliant. It was all really well designed. So I don't know whether you would have a neoclassicist bent to it. I would call it solid Northern building.
It's a lot of industrial buildings, isn't it, in that part of Newcastle, that they put the activities that were smelly and noisy away from where a lot of the housing, particularly the more expensive housing, was. What's missing probably is your more 1970s brutalists, because the land was abandoned at that point. It's much more recent architecture.
That's very true.
I think the other thing as well is that I'm not sure whether attempts have been made to blend the architecture. For example, the mailings would look quite modern, but it's very boxy. Does it fit in? And that's obviously, it's an individual preference. Does it fit in? Does Steenberg's fit in? But because they're down at the mouth and they're not nearer to the Cluny and they're not nearer to the, the 7 stories, they create their own little area of architecture. Whereas as you go further north on the valley, it becomes quite gritty, I think is the word I would use.
Yeah. If you watch the video I just showed you a short extract of, there's some very interesting discussion of some of the 1980s plans. If you think of Biker Wall and some of the big developments there, it didn't go down into the Ouseburn. There were great ideas they had that didn't quite happen.
The other thing as well is if you go beyond the bridge and you go towards Jesmond Vale, the Heaton area of housing there is elegant, but it's not so much factory based. It's based on streets, based on terraces, solid building yet again. That's true.
Yeah, I suppose all of our earlier comments are the Lower Ouseburn, aren't they? We were talking about the more industrial bit.
Yeah,
that's there, which was even industrial in the Roman period, I believe.
If you look at Lime Street as well, there are beautiful arches on 7 stories. The brickwork's fantastic. It really is.
Peter, would you like to say anything about the comments in the chat about the photograph in Manchester that you?
That's there. It's a lovely piece of comments. I had major problems at that point because I couldn't get the comments in my slide up on screen, so apologies. Sense of place is great. I love the fact that you're commenting on the man in the middle who's fallen over but wants to protect his alcohol.
Yeah.
That's there. There's people have talked about different working classes, service, nighttime economy that's there, chilling, bias, emotional. There's some interesting elements that were there. Really, it's a great photograph. It won actual awards. The documentary photographer hadn't realized what he'd taken until afterwards. But I think it does show all of those. But to what extent are those in your head as the viewer seeing it? And to what extent is it in the image that I could annotate, draw around and say, this in the photograph shows this about working class people. This in the photograph shows this about the lived experience, which is some of the words you were using. So I was really trying to use it at that stage of going beyond that quick look at a photograph, nice, save, don't want, get rid of, which is our kind of attitude to photos on our phones nowadays, and starting to spend a bit of time looking at them. And you could easily, with the photos I showed later when I broke them up into quarters, spend 15 or so minutes in a photograph really starting to get what we would call your eye in, starting to be able to see the features. In the same way it takes a bit of time to understand maps and read them, it takes a little bit of effort to understand photographs and read those as well.
Have you any knowledge of this photo in the chat, the Wild West Denton, Enter If You Dare?
There was, it does ring a dim and distant bell. There are a whole series of photographs people have taken of graffiti that's quite symbolic. If you think about some of the graffiti that's being used during the first COVID lockdown, which was, or indeed some of the images students have done in halls of residence with, you know, about prisoners and bring alcohol usually as the line underneath, isn't it? Or some famous graffiti about particular people or particular places, or the way graffiti has been used as protest. Think about Northern Ireland and the way graffiti then became art, then became symbolic of both sides. So I haven't had a chance to look for that image. It does ring a dim and distant bell.
Right. Does anybody have any other questions that they quickly want to put on the chats?
Yeah.
If not,
good question about what is graffiti or not. When is it art and when is it? Yeah. Thanks, Joe.
Yes. Very interesting, actually. Yes, could have a session on that. So we've had a really interesting afternoon. Thank you so much, Liz and Peter, for that. Can I just mention a number of things? Could you remember to write to Louise if you need or would like to have a certificate? And what we have on screen now is a list of our future talks. Next Monday will be very interesting indeed, if you can come along. Jill Miller, who was president of the GA last year, is talking about globalization and the environment. She's talked to us, or given us talks before. They're really interesting. Try to come to that. And then we've got a talk by Chris Spate on the 14th of December on geography careers. And we've got a wonderful amount of talks so far, although we are still working on them to add more, even more in the new year. But just very much to sort of finish this talk, to highlight Peter's talk on geophotography. If you've enjoyed the work on photography today, you'll find it really fascinating, this talk on geophotography and how photography reflects and influences our changing geography. So please come along to more of our talks, and we would very much like to see you there. And thank you to everybody.